I thought leaving would be the hard part. Turns out the door opening was easy. It was everything after that broke me down. You spend your whole life dreaming about what's on the other side, and then you cross over and realize you brought nothing with you that actually matters out here. The vault didn't just keep me safe, it kept me functional. And now I'm neither. I was 11 when I first put my hand against the vault door. Not the airlock, not the entry tunnel. The door itself, the massive circular slab of reinforced steel that separated everything I knew from everything I'd never seen. My palm looked small against it, pale and soft. Fingers spread like I was trying to feel a heartbeat through all that metal. It was cool to the touch, always cool, no matter how warm the recycled air got during the day cycle. I stood there long enough that my mother found me, her hand settling on my shoulder without words. She didn't ask what I was doing. She already knew. Everyone in Vault 47 touched the door eventually. Some people did it once, a private ritual, then never again. Others made it a habit, a sort of pilgrimage to the lowest level during their off-shift hours, standing in the dim maintenance lighting with their foreheads pressed against the steel. I saw a man cry there once, shoulders shaking, his breath fogging against the metal. Nobody disturbed him. The security officer stationed nearby Martinez, I think, though names blur now, looked away deliberately, studying the wall panel like it held secrets. The door was the truth we all carried, but rarely spoke aloud. We were inside, the world was outside. And the distance between those two facts was measured in tons of immovable metal and the absolute silence of a seal that hadn't broken in 73 years. My mother never told me not to dream about opening it. She was smarter than that. Prohibition makes things precious. Instead, she told me about air pressure differentials and radiation shielding and the engineering specifications that made the door simultaneously our greatest protection and our most permanent cage. She spoke about it the way other parents might describe weather, as a fact of existence, neither good nor bad, simply there. I learned early that the vault had two populations, those who had accepted the permanence and those who hadn't yet. The accepted ones moved through the corridors with a certain settled quality, their routines worn smooth by repetition. They knew the 347 people who shared their air. They knew which water recycler made a ticking sound on the third rotation and which section of the hydroponics bay always smelled faintly of copper. They celebrated birthdays and worked their shifts and fell in love within the permitted parameters of genetic diversity. They built lives that fit inside the available space. The others never quite settled. You could see it in how they walked, always with their eyes drifting upward, as if the curved ceiling might reveal sky if they looked hard enough. They volunteered for maintenance duty in the outer sections, closest to the door. They read the old records obsessively, the ones from before the ceiling, when the vault still connected to something beyond itself. They had children reluctantly, if at all, because how do you promise a future to someone when you can't promise them horizon? I was 14 when I realized I belonged to the second group. The realization arrived during a history lesson, one of the mandatory educational sessions piped through the communal spaces. The teacher, a woman named Dr. Reeves, whose voice had gone soft from years of speaking to the same small audience, was explaining the vault's purpose with careful neutrality: preservation of human life, continuation of civilization, protection from catastrophic environmental collapse. All true, all accurate, all insufficient. My chest had gone tight, listening to her, a feeling like the walls contracting, like the air losing oxygen molecule by molecule. I looked around the classroom at the other students, wondering if they felt it too, but their faces showed only the polite attention of people hearing familiar information. They were learning history. I was realizing I was living inside a tomb that happened to have working lights and a water filtration system. I started mapping the vault after that. Not officially, there were already detailed schematics available in the database, maintained by the engineering department with religious precision. But I wanted to know it differently. I wanted to understand the space the way you understand your own body, through movement and touch, rather than diagrams. 300,000 square feet, distributed across 4 levels. Residential quarters for 500 occupants at capacity, though we'd never reached that number. Current population, 321. Common areas, educational facilities, medical wing, engineering, hydroponics, water treatment, power generation, storage. Everything necessary, everything sufficient, everything the same. I found the small places. The maintenance shaft behind the water recycling plant where you could sit and hear the pipes humming, a sound almost like wind if you didn't think too hard about what wind actually sounded like. The observation deck overlooking the hydroponics bay, where the grow lights created something almost like sunlight during the cultivation cycle. The archive room in sub-level 3, where the old paper records were kept in climate-controlled darkness, smelling of age and careful preservation. That room became mine in a way no space could truly be owned in a vault. I went there during my free hours, reading through personnel files and maintenance logs and incident reports dating back to the ceiling. I read them like prayers, like scripture, searching for evidence that someone else had felt this same desperate restlessness. I found it everywhere. Year 3. A man named Robert Chen had attempted to override the door controls. He'd made it as far as the primary authentication sequence before security stopped him. The report noted he'd been emotionally distressed and struggling with adjustment to Vault life. He'd been placed under psychiatric observation for 6 months. The later records showed he'd recovered, found useful work in the machine shop, married, had 2 children. The incident was filed away as resolved. Year 17. A woman named Sarah Okonkwo had simply walked down to the door and sat in front of it for 42 hours without moving, eating, or speaking. When medical staff finally intervened, she'd asked them a single question: "How do you know it's still dangerous out there?" She couldn't explain what had prompted the question. She didn't resist when they took her to medical. 3 months later, she returned to her position in hydroponics. Her file contained a note from the chief psychiatrist: "Patient has accepted necessary limitations." Year 29, Year 44, Year 56. The pattern repeated with minor variations. People broke against the door the way water breaks against stone, not all at once, but gradually, in moments of pressure that left marks in the record. I was 16 when I understood that I would eventually be one of those incidents, just a matter of time. My parents saw it coming. They never said so directly, but I caught the looks they exchanged when I mentioned surface conditions during dinner conversation. When I started requesting additional educational materials about radiation biology and environmental contamination. When I asked too many questions about the Vault's supply reserves and how long they were projected to last. My father tried practical redirection. He got me assigned to the engineering rotation, thinking hands-on technical work might satisfy whatever was moving restlessly inside me. I learned the systems, learned them thoroughly. Learned every pipe and wire and mechanical junction that kept 321 people breathing recycled air and drinking reclaimed water and eating vegetables grown under artificial light. The knowledge didn't help. It made things worse, because now I could quantify exactly how elaborate our cage was. How many redundant systems and fail-safes and backup protocols existed solely to ensure we stayed exactly where we were. The vault wasn't just locked, it was engineered for permanence. My mother took a different approach. She started telling me about the world before, the one she'd heard about from her grandmother, who'd been alive during the sealing. Not the official history from the educational database, but the personal version, smaller, more specific, less sanitized. Her grandmother had worked in advertising, apparently, had owned a car, had complained about traffic and weather and the price of coffee, had taken the sealing harder than most because she'd spent 43 years assuming the world would stay stable and available, that doors would remain doors rather than becoming walls. She never accepted it, my mother told me quietly, during one of our late-night conversations in the residential quarters common area. She went to her death believing it was temporary, that someone would figure out how to make it safe again, and the door would open, and she'd walk back out into a world that had been waiting for her. Was that better, I asked, than accepting? My mother was quiet for a long time. Around us, the vault hummed with its perpetual mechanical breathing. Finally, I don't know. She was unhappy, but she was also still herself. The people who accepted, I'm not sure they were happier, just quieter. I was 17 when the door opened. Not permanently. Not for escape. For intake. It happened during third shift, when most of the vault was sleeping. The alarm that sounded wasn't the emergency klaxon we'd all been trained to recognize. It was different. A steady, rhythmic pulse that I'd never heard before. I woke with my heart already racing, some animal part of me recognizing significance before my conscious mind caught up. My father was already in the hallway when I emerged from our quarters. Half the residential level was there, people in sleep clothes and confused expressions, everyone asking the same question without words. The intercom crackled, and the overseer's voice came through with careful neutrality. All residents remain in residential areas. This is not an emergency. Repeat, this is not an emergency. Security personnel report to Level 1. Medical staff report to intake processing. Not an emergency. But the door was cycling. You could feel it, even from the residential level, 3 floors up. A vibration in the walls, a pressure change in the air, a sense of massive mechanical systems engaging for the first time in living memory. I tried to imagine what it sounded like at ground zero. That enormous disk of steel moving in its track, breaking seals that had held for 73 years. We waited. There was nothing else to do. The overseer's voice had been clear: remain in place. But people gathered in the common areas anyway, drawn together by shared tension. Someone started coffee in the communal dispenser. Someone else retrieved cards and started a game with shaking hands, less for entertainment than for something to do with the nervous energy. I couldn't sit. I paced the corridor outside our quarters, wearing a path in the already worn floor. My mother stood in the doorway watching me with an expression I couldn't read. Don't, she said finally. Don't what? Whatever you're thinking, don't. But she didn't know what I was thinking. I barely knew myself. The door had opened. That fact alone had rearranged every assumption I'd built my life around. If it could open for intake, it could open for other reasons. If it had opened once, it could open again. The possibilities were dizzying. 2 hours later, the intercom crackled again. The overseer's voice had gone carefully informative, the tone someone uses when they're working hard to maintain calm. We have successfully completed intake of 7 survivors from the surface. They are currently undergoing medical screening and decontamination. All residents should continue normal routines. A general assembly will be scheduled to address questions and concerns. 7 people. From outside, the common areas erupted in conversation. Everyone had questions. Where had they come from? How had they survived? What were conditions like on the surface? How had they found the vault? Why now, after 73 years? I didn't join the speculation. I was thinking about the decontamination protocol, which I knew from my engineering rotation. The process took a minimum of 72 hours isolation, multiple stages of chemical treatment, radiation assessment, medical evaluation, 3 days before the survivors would have any contact with the general population. 3 days to prepare questions I'd been accumulating my entire life. The assembly happened 5 days later. The overseer believed in thoroughness. We gathered in the largest common space, the multi-purpose hall that usually hosted educational sessions and social events. 321 people, minus those on essential shift work, packed into rows of chairs with the kind of nervous anticipation usually reserved for entertainment. But this wasn't entertainment. This was the first genuine unknown to enter our controlled environment in 73 years. The overseer stood at the front with 4 of the survivors. 3 others were still in medical. According to the brief announcement, nothing serious, just additional observation. The 4 who stood before us looked wrong in ways I struggled to articulate. They wore Vault-issued clothing, clean jumpsuits in standard blue, but somehow the fabric sat differently on them. Their posture was wrong. Their eyes were wrong, not in color or shape, but in movement, the way they scanned the room with a kind of perpetual vigilance that no vault resident had ever needed to develop. The oldest of them, a man who might have been 50 or might have been 35, spoke first. His voice had a quality to it like wind over rocks, rough, weathered, used to carrying across open space. "Appreciate the hospitality," he said. "No, it's not standard procedure, taking in surface dwellers. We're grateful." The overseer inclined his head. "We're pleased we could assist. Perhaps you could tell us about your circumstances. How you came to find Vault 47? The man, he gave his name as Marcus, though I suspected that might not have been the name he was born with, explained in broad strokes. They'd been part of a settlement cluster about 100 miles east. Raiders had hit them hard, scattered survivors in all directions. He and his people had been traveling for weeks, following old road markers and pre-war maps when they'd picked up the Vault's automated beacon signal. "Didn't know if it was still active," Marcus said. "Most Vaults we've encountered are either sealed permanent or gone dark decades ago. Figured it was worth checking. When we got close enough to trigger the proximity sensors and the door actually responded." He trailed off, shaking his head. That was something. Questions erupted from the assembled residents. The overseer tried to maintain order, but the control was slipping. People wanted to know everything about the surface, about radiation levels, about the raiders, about other settlements, about whether it was truly as dangerous as we'd been told. Marcus and the other survivors answered with a patience that felt practiced. Yes, radiation was still a concern in certain areas. No, it wasn't uniformly lethal. You learned to read the signs, carry a dosimeter, know which ruins to avoid. Yes, there were dangerous elements, raiders, mutated creatures, territorial disputes, but there were also communities, trade routes, people finding ways to survive and even build. I listened with a hunger that felt physical. Every word was confirmation of something I'd known without proof, that life existed outside, that the world beyond the door wasn't simply endless wasteland, that human beings adapted and endured in conditions our Vault protocols deemed catastrophically unsuitable. But I also heard what Marcus wasn't saying, the spaces between his words, the way he described losing people with an emotional efficiency that spoke to frequent practice. The casual mention of radiation sickness symptoms that sounded horrific, even in summary. The acknowledgement that their settlement had lasted barely 3 years before raiders destroyed it. "But you survived," someone called from the back. "You're here. You made it." Marcus smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "We're the ones still walking. Doesn't make us the lucky ones necessarily, just the stubborn." The assembly lasted another hour, but I barely tracked it. My mind was already elsewhere, already racing ahead to possibilities. These people had done it, had lived outside the Vault, had traveled across the wasteland, had survived. If they could do it, why couldn't I? The question that should have followed was, did I want to? The answer felt obvious, self-evident, the culmination of years of restless dreaming. Of course I wanted to. The Vault was suffocating me slowly, day by day, recycled breath by recycled breath. Outside meant freedom, possibility, horizon. Outside meant becoming something more than a file in the personnel database, a name on a shift rotation, a statistic in the Vault's carefully managed genetic diversity pool. But that night, lying in my bunk while my parents slept in the adjacent room, I couldn't escape a creeping sense of wrongness. Not about wanting to leave that felt pure and clear and true, but about the wanting itself, the way it had crystallized so quickly from abstract yearning into concrete possibility. The survivors had been here less than a week, and I was already mentally planning my escape, as if their arrival was some kind of sign, some universal permission to act on impulses I'd been suppressing for years. The realization was uncomfortable. I didn't actually know anything more about the surface than I had before they arrived. I had Marcus's descriptions, filtered through his experience and perspective. I had no practical knowledge of radiation navigation, no survival skills, no understanding of how to read terrain or find water, or avoid the dangers he'd mentioned with such casual familiarity. I had enthusiasm. I had desperation. I had a body built for controlled environment, living, and a mind full of technical specifications for machines that would be useless outside. I pushed the doubts away. People learned. People adapted. The survivors themselves were proof. I started preparing with the intensity of someone planning a military operation. Not openly, I wasn't stupid enough to announce my intentions. But in small ways, careful accumulations, I volunteered for additional time in the archives, reading everything available about surface conditions, pre-war geography, survival techniques. I requested cross-training in medical, claiming interest in expanding my skill set, really learning basic field treatment and medication protocols. I began hoarding supplies a little at a time, nothing that would trigger inventory alerts. Water purification tablets, preserved food, a radiation dosimeter I signed out for educational purposes. I told myself it was responsible preparation. I was being smart, being thorough. I didn't let myself think too hard about the fact that I was also being deceptive, systematically lying to everyone who cared about me, building a secret that grew heavier every day. The survivors integrated into Vault life with varying degrees of success. Marcus adapted fastest, his natural authority finding purpose in helping with security protocols. The others struggled more visibly. One woman, Elena, couldn't sleep in the enclosed quarters. She'd been found twice wandering the corridors during sleep cycle, disoriented and distressed. A younger man named Corey kept trying to access the door controls, not to open them, just to be near them, like an addict circling their substance of choice. I watched them carefully, cataloging behaviors and reactions. These were people who'd lived outside. If they were struggling inside the vault, what did that mean for someone like me going the opposite direction? But I didn't let the observations slow my preparations. If anything, their difficulty convinced me further. They didn't belong in the vault because they'd lived with sky and horizon. I didn't belong in the vault because I'd never stopped dreaming of them. We were all displaced, just in different directions. 3 months after their arrival, Marcus found me in the archive room during a late shift. I'd been reading a pre-war geological survey, trying to understand the terrain between the vault and the nearest marked settlement. He didn't announce himself, just settled into the chair across the table with the quiet economy of movement I'd learned meant someone accustomed to conserving energy. "You're planning to leave," he said. Not a question. I considered lying, decided it was pointless. "Yes." He nodded slowly, his weathered hands folded on the table between us. "Figured. You got that look. Had a kid in our settlement. Same look. Wanted to see what was beyond the horizon, couldn't rest until he'd walked it." "Did he?" "For a while. Died about 6 months after he left. Deathclaw got him while he was sleeping. Probably didn't even wake up." Marcus said it the same way he might report the weather. "Not telling you that to scare you, just so you know wanting something doesn't make you equipped for it." "I'm preparing," I said. "Learning. I'm not just going to walk out unprepared." Kid thought the same thing. He prepared too. Read everything he could find, practiced survival skills, made a pack with all the right supplies. Marcus leaned back, his eyes distant. What he couldn't prepare for was the not knowing, the constant uncertainty, the way every decision might be the one that kills you, and you won't know which until it's too late. "People survive," I said. "You survived. Some of us did. Most didn't." He met my eyes directly. "You know how many people were in our settlement when the raiders hit?" 43. "You know how many of us made it here?" 7. "And one of those died in medical last week. Radiation sickness, too far progressed to treat." The news hit like cold water. The overseer hadn't announced it. Maybe he was still deciding how to frame it for Vault residents who'd never had to process the death of someone from outside their closed community. "I didn't know," I said quietly. "No reason you would. Point is the 7 of us, We're not the strong ones, or the smart ones, or the prepared ones. We're just the ones who happened to make the right guesses in the right moments and got lucky more times than we got unlucky. That's all survival out there is, extended luck. He stood to leave, then paused at the door. Won't try to stop you, not my place. But do me a favor, wait until you're 20. Give yourself 2 more years to be sure. If you still want it then, I'll help you prepare properly. Deal? I wanted to argue that 2 years was forever, that I'd already waited my entire life. But something in his expression stopped me. Not judgment, just a kind of tired understanding. Deal, I said. I meant it when I said it. I honestly believed I could wait 2 more years. I lasted 8 more months. The breaking point wasn't dramatic. No single incident, no catalyst moment. Just the slow accumulation of sameness, day after identical day, until the weight of it exceeded my capacity to carry it. I woke up on my 19th birthday and couldn't breathe. Not metaphorically, literally couldn't draw a full breath, like the air had gone thin and insufficient. I sat on the edge of my bunk, gasping while my mother asked questions I couldn't answer because I didn't have the air to form words. It passed. Eventually, the panic receded and oxygen started finding its way into my lungs properly again. But the aftermath was worse than the attack itself, because I understood with absolute clarity that it would happen again. And again, until I either did something about it or it broke me completely. That day I told my parents I was leaving. We were in our quarters, the small contained space that had been home for 19 years. My father sat very still in his chair, his hands folded in his lap. My mother stood by the small shelf where she kept her books, one hand resting on the spines like she was drawing strength from their solidity. When? My father asked finally. Soon. Next few weeks probably. This is about Marcus and the others. This is about me, I said. It's always been about me. They just proved it was possible. My mother turned from the bookshelf. Her eyes were dry, her expression carefully controlled. You understand you can't come back. The vault, the door. I know. The protocols were clear. Once you left, you were outside permanently. The risk of contamination, the impossibility of vetting surface dwellers, the need to maintain environmental integrity. I know I can't come back. So, you're choosing to lose us, my father said quietly, permanently. The words landed like he'd intended them to, heavy, accusatory, designed to make me question. But they didn't land the way he expected. Because the truth was, I'd already lost them. Lost them years ago. The first time I put my hand against the door and felt the pull of something beyond. We'd been living in the same space but not the same reality, them settled into vault life, and me perpetually elsewhere in my mind. I'm choosing to live, I said, however long that turns out to be. We talked for hours. Or they talked, and I listened, hearing every argument I'd already made to myself 1,000 times. The dangers, the radiation, the violence, the uncertainty, the fact that I had no real understanding of what I was walking into, the reality that I might last days, hours, minutes once I crossed that threshold. All true, all irrelevant. You'll die out there, my mother said finally, her composure cracking. You understand that, right? Maybe not immediately, but soon, and we won't know when or how. We'll just be here, wondering. Forever. You'll know I was free, I said. She looked at me for a long moment, then turned away. Freedom's another word for nothing left to lose. You still have things to lose. You just don't value them the way we hoped you would. The words stung because they weren't completely wrong. I did value them. I loved my parents, loved the community I'd grown up in, loved the safety and certainty of vault life. But I valued the possibility of something else more. And there was no way to say that without it sounding like abandonment, because at its core, that's what it was. I spent the next 3 weeks saying goodbye to a place I'd never actually belonged to, walking the corridors I'd mapped, sitting in the archive room, standing in the hydroponics bay under the artificial sun, touching the door one last time, feeling its cool permanence. Marcus helped me prepare, honoring his promise despite my breaking mine about waiting. He taught me things the archive files couldn't: how to read the sky for radiation storms, how to move quietly through ruins, how to make quick assessments about threats versus resources. He taught me the survivor's mantra: notice everything, trust nothing, move before you think. Thinking gets you killed, he explained. Out there, your instincts need to be faster than your analysis. You feel wrong, you move. You see movement, you assess threat level before you assess curiosity level. Everything else is luxury. He also taught me about the weight. Not physical weight, though that mattered too. The psychological weight of constant vigilance, constant decision-making, constant awareness that you were always potentially seconds from death. In here, he gestured around the vault, you can relax. You can be careless. You can have a bad day and survive it. Out there, a bad day is the last day. You can't ever fully rest. That weight, it accumulates. It changes you. You need to know that going in. I thought I understood. I didn't, obviously. Understanding comes from experience, not explanation. But I appreciated him trying. The overseer called me in 4 days before my planned departure. His office was in the administrative section, a small space made smaller by filing cabinets and old furniture. He sat behind a desk that had probably been there since the vault was sealed, his hands folded on the surface. I can't stop you, he said without preamble. You're legally an adult. You're entitled to make your own choices, even self-destructive ones. I'm not trying to be destructive. No, you're trying to be free. I understand the impulse. He leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight. But I need you to understand what you're doing to the people who stay. Your parents will live the rest of their lives wondering. Your friends will live with the knowledge that someone they cared about chose probable death over continued community with them. The younger residents will see your choice as validation of their own restlessness. So I should stay miserable to avoid making other people uncomfortable? No. He surprised me with the directness. I'm not arguing you should stay. I'm arguing you should acknowledge the full cost, not just to yourself. You're not the only person affected by your freedom. We sat in silence for a moment. Finally, I've already made my choice. I know. He pulled out a small box from his desk drawer. Then make it count. This is a long-range radio beacon, pre-war tech, still functional. If you survive, if you find something worth surviving for, activate it. Let us know. It won't change anything, but at least your parents won't spend the rest of their lives wondering if you died in the first hour. I took the beacon, feeling its weight in my palm. Such a small thing to carry such significance. Thank you, I said. Don't thank me yet. Thank me if you ever actually use it. The night before I left, the vault held an informal gathering. Not official, the overseer didn't sanction it, but people came anyway, filling the common area with quiet conversation and shared food. It felt like a wake for someone still living. People gave me things, practical things, mostly preserved food, medical supplies, a reinforced jacket someone's grandmother had owned before the sealing, but also personal things. A photograph of the hydroponics bay, a handwritten copy of a poem, a small stone someone had found in the geological sample archive, saved from before the world ended. I tried to refuse most of it, tried to explain I needed to travel light, but people needed to give, needed to feel like they were helping, needed some kind of closure for a relationship that was ending. My mother hugged me, long and tight, then stepped back without words. My father pressed something into my hand, his personal multi-tool, worn smooth from years of use. Your grandfather's, he said, made it through the war. Maybe it'll make it through whatever comes next. Marcus found me as people were dispersing. He didn't offer platitudes or last-minute advice, just clasped my shoulder briefly and said, "Move before you think." I slept in my bunk one last time, or tried to sleep. Mostly I lay there listening to the vault's mechanical breathing, committing it to memory, the hum of the air recyclers, the distant sound of water moving through pipes, the occasional footsteps in the corridor outside. At some point I did sleep, because I woke to my alarm with a start, disoriented by the significance of the day. This was it, the day I'd been building toward for years. I dressed in Leia's Vault suit underneath, reinforced clothing over it, packed my bag with careful precision, every item considered for weight versus utility, checked and rechecked my supplies. Strapped the dosimeter to my wrist. Put the radio beacon in the most protected pocket I had. My parents were already awake, waiting in the small common space between our rooms. We looked at each other across the familiar distance, all the words already spoken, nothing left but the actual moment of separation. "Be smart," my father said finally. "Be alive," my mother added. I nodded, not trusting my voice, and left before I could lose my nerve. The walk to the vault door felt longer than it ever had before. People I'd known my entire life stood in their doorways, watching me pass. Some nodded, some looked away. Some just stared with expressions I couldn't interpret. Marcus was waiting at the door control station, along with the overseer and 2 security personnel. The protocol required witnesses, required official documentation of voluntary departure. I had to sign a release form, absolving the vault of responsibility for my survival. Had to formally acknowledge I understood the risks and consequences. The overseer read the standard statement about door procedures and contamination protocols, about how the outer door would open long enough for me to pass through, then seal behind me immediately. About how there would be no secondary entry, no return passage, no exceptions. "Do you understand and accept these terms?" he asked formally. "I do." He nodded to the security officer at the control panel. The woman, I realized I didn't know her name, had never bothered to learn it entered the authorization sequence. Warning lights began flashing. An alarm tone sounded, loud in the sudden silence of people holding their breath. The door began to move. Even expecting it, the sound was overwhelming. Metal scraping against metal, machinery engaging that had been silent for decades, seals breaking with sounds like gunshots. The massive circular door rotated in its track, revealing darkness beyond. Not complete darkness. There was light somewhere out there, faint, distant, wrong somehow, but present. "You've got 60 seconds, the overseer said, his voice cutting through the mechanical noise. "After that, the door closes, whether you're clear or not." I looked back one last time, saw my parents in the crowd that had gathered despite protocol, saw the faces of people I'd lived my entire life among, saw the vault stretching behind them, all those corridors and rooms and familiar spaces. Safe, known, sufficient. Suffocating. I turned back to the open door and walked through. The transition was immediate and visceral. The air changed first, no longer recycled and cleaned and temperature controlled. It was cold and smelled wrong, like metal and dust and something organic I didn't have words for. My skin registered the difference before my mind did, goosebumps rising on my arms under the layers. The light was wrong too. Not the clean artificial light of the vault, but something grey and diffuse, coming from above in a way I'd only read about. Sky. I was seeing actual sky for the first time in my life. I kept walking, moving away from the door, even though every instinct screamed to stop and stare. Behind me, I heard the machinery engaging again, the door beginning its closing cycle. 60 seconds, probably already down to 45, 30, 15. The sound of the seal engaging was final in a way that made my chest tight. I turned around, looking back at the massive circular door now flush with the rock face, nearly invisible if you didn't know what you were looking for. Behind it, my entire life, everyone I'd ever known, every certainty I'd ever had. Gone. I stood there breathing air that had never been filtered, feeling wind for the first time, actual wind, not the artificial circulation of climate control but real air moving across open space. It was cold and strange and carried smells I couldn't identify. Above me, the sky. Grey and enormous, bigger than any ceiling I'd ever imagined, so vast my mind couldn't properly process the scale. I'd read descriptions, seen photographs in the archives, but nothing had prepared me for the actual experience of that much open space overhead. I felt simultaneously liberated and exposed, free and vulnerable, alive and acutely aware of my own fragility. The terrain around the vault entrance was rocky and barren, no vegetation visible anywhere. Just stone and dirt and the scattered debris of pre-war construction, broken concrete, twisted metal, the crumbled remains of what might have been a road once. I checked my dosimeter. The reading was elevated but not critical, the kind of background radiation Marcus had taught me to expect, manageable for limited exposure. I'd need to find better shelter before nightfall, but I had time. The question was, which direction? Marcus had sketched a rough map for me, based on his memory of the journey here. The nearest known settlement was roughly northwest, maybe a week's travel if conditions were favorable. But favorable was relative, and his map had been drawn from memory of a route traveled under duress. I chose northwest because it was something, a direction that was more than random. Started walking because standing still wasn't survival. The first hour was euphoria. Pure, uncomplicated joy at the fact of movement through open space. I'd done it. I'd actually left. I was outside, walking on ground that stretched to a horizon I could actually see, breathing air that had never been through a recycler. The second hour was harder. The euphoria wore off, and reality started asserting itself. My feet hurt. The vault boots weren't designed for irregular terrain. My pack was heavier than it had seemed in controlled testing. The wind was constant and cold, cutting through my layers in ways I hadn't anticipated. By the third hour, I understood what Marcus had meant about the weight. The constant vigilance, the perpetual assessment of every sight and sound, the awareness that I didn't actually know what I was doing or where I was going or what I'd do if I encountered any of the threats he'd described. I was free. I was also completely, terrifyingly alone. The landscape was harsh and unforgiving in ways the vault had never prepared me for. In the vault, every surface was smooth and intentional, designed for human comfort and utility. Out here, nothing cared about my comfort. The ground was uneven and treacherous. The rocks had sharp edges. The ruins I passed, and there were ruins everywhere, skeletal remains of the world before, were unstable and dangerous. I nearly fell twice in the first 4 hours, catching myself at the last second on outcroppings that cut my hands even through gloves. My ankles ached from the constant adjustment to uneven footing. My lungs burned from breathing cold air with actual particulate matter in it, not the filtered perfection I'd grown up with. But I kept moving, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant acknowledging the magnitude of what I'd done. Nightfall came faster than I expected. The grey light that passed for day simply faded. Didn't disappear. The darkness never became complete, but the light dimmed to something even more uncertain and strange. I found a partially collapsed building that offered some shelter from the wind, cleared enough debris to make a space I could lie down in, and tried to rest. Rest was impossible. Every sound was magnified by darkness and ignorance. Metal creaking in the wind became potential threats. Distant sounds I couldn't identify became imagined monsters. My mind, trained for controlled environments and predictable variables, went into overdrive trying to categorize and assess dangers I had no framework for understanding. I lay there in the dark, staring at ruins silhouetted against a sky that showed stars, actual stars, thousands of them, more than I'd ever imagined possible. Beautiful and indifferent and so far away, they might as well have been fictional. On my wrist, the dosimeter clicked occasionally, measuring radiation I couldn't see or feel, but that was gradually accumulating in my cells. Each click a small reminder of invisible danger, the kind of threat the vault had been designed to prevent. I thought about my parents, wondered if they were sleeping, or if they were lying awake too, wondering if I was already dead. Wondered if I should activate the beacon, send them a signal that I'd survived the first day. Decided against it. One day wasn't survival. One day was just deferring death. I must have slept eventually, because I woke to grey light and the sound of something moving outside my shelter. My hand went immediately to the knife. Marcus had given me a gesture he'd drilled into me, weapon first, assessment second. The movement resolved into a shape, four-legged, roughly dog-sized, moving with a kind of predatory purpose that made my stomach clench. It paused outside the building, nose to the ground, clearly tracking something. Tracking me. It took every bit of discipline Marcus had tried to teach me to stay still and quiet. Every instinct screamed to run, to make noise, to do something other than be potential prey. But movement meant visibility, and visibility meant becoming target instead of uncertainty. The creature, I couldn't tell what it had been before mutation. If it had been anything recognizable, circled the building twice, then moved on, heading in a direction that would have intercepted my path if I'd kept traveling at night like I'd briefly considered. When I finally exhaled, my hands were shaking. That was the first real lesson. The vault had made me pray. Not intentionally, not maliciously, but inevitably. 19 years in a controlled environment where the greatest danger was equipment malfunction or social conflict had left me completely unprepared for a world where things actively wanted to kill me. I stayed in the ruined building longer than I should have, trying to convince myself to move. The second lesson was already asserting itself. Fear was cumulative. Each threat, even survived, added to the weight Marcus had warned about, made the next step harder, the next decision more fraught. Eventually I moved, because staying meant dying slowly of dehydration and starvation. Better to die moving than waiting. The second day was worse than the first. The euphoria was completely gone, replaced by grinding awareness of discomfort and inadequacy. My feet blistered. My shoulders ached from the pack. My eyes hurt from the constant brightness. Even gray sky was more light than the vault had ever subjected me to. I found water in a partially collapsed building's basement, pooled in a concrete depression. My dosimeter spiked when I got close. The water was definitely contaminated. I used one of my precious purification tablets, watched the chemical reaction turn the water cloudy then clear, and drank anyway because I didn't have a choice. It tasted wrong. Not poisonous, wrong, the tablet had done its job, but different from vault water in ways I couldn't articulate. Less pure, more present, like it carried memory of the ground it had filtered through. That night I found better shelter, an underground space that had probably been a storage facility once. The door was half torn off, but the walls were thick and the ceiling intact. I could hear wind outside but barely feel it. Small mercy. I ate some of the preserved food I'd brought, rationing it carefully. Checked my supplies and made the calculation I'd been avoiding. At this rate, I had maybe 5 more days of food. Water would last longer if I could find more sources and keep purifying it, but food was finite. 5 days to reach the settlement Marcus had described. If I could maintain pace, if I didn't get injured, if I could find the route, if the settlement still existed. A lot of ifs. I activated the radio beacon that night. Not to call for help, nothing could help from this distance, but to send the signal the overseer had mentioned. A simple pulse that would register in the vault's monitoring systems, confirmation that I'd survived 2 days. It felt like failure and triumph simultaneously. Proof I was alive. Acknowledgement I'd already needed to prove it. The third day, I got lost. Or rather, I realized I'd already been lost and just hadn't admitted it to myself. Marcus's map was based on landmarks that either no longer existed or that I couldn't identify from his descriptions. The route he'd described depended on recognizing terrain features I had no experience reading. I stood on a ridge overlooking a landscape that all looked the same: rubble and ruins and empty spaces stretching in every direction. Trying to match what I saw to what I remembered from the map was like trying to match clouds to photographs. I chose a direction and kept walking because the alternative was paralysis. That was when I started to understand what my mother had meant about freedom being nothing left to lose. Every step away from the vault was a step deeper into uncertainty. Every choice was made with incomplete information and mounting desperation. Freedom wasn't liberation, it was the weight of consequence landing entirely on your own shoulders. In the vault, decisions were constrained but supported. You couldn't do everything, but the things you could do were possible. Out here, everything was theoretically possible and actually impossible. I could walk in any direction I wanted. None of them led anywhere I could survive. The fourth day, I saw other people for the first time. Distance was hard to judge without experience, but they were far enough that I couldn't make out details. 3 figures moving along what might have been a road, heading roughly perpendicular to my direction. They moved with purpose, with knowledge of where they were going. My first instinct was to call out, to run toward them, to seek help from anyone who might know more than I did. Marcus's training stopped me. Strangers weren't automatically allies. In fact, they were more likely to be threats. Resources were scarce enough that trust was a luxury most survivors couldn't afford. I watched them from concealment until they passed out of sight, then sat for a long time trying to decide if I'd made the right choice. Maybe they would have helped. Maybe they would have directed me to the settlement. Maybe they would have shared supplies. Maybe they would have killed me for my pack. No way to know. That was the thing about the outside. Every choice carried invisible stakes, and you only found out the real cost after it was too late to choose differently. That night I couldn't find good shelter. Ended up in the partial lee of a collapsed wall, exposed to wind and the radiation that came with it. My dosimeter's readings were climbing, not critically but noticeably. The accumulation Marcus had warned about. I was poisoning myself just by existing out here. Slowly, molecule by molecule, my cells were taking damage that would eventually add up to sickness or cancer or just general system failure. The vault had protected against that thick walls and filtration and controlled exposure. Out here, protection was provisional and incomplete. I'd known this intellectually, had read about radiation exposure and cumulative damage, but knowing and experiencing were different things. Lying in the dark, listening to the dosimeter click while wind cut through my layers and my stomach cramped from inadequate food that was understanding. The 5th day, I found a body. Not fresh weeks old, maybe months, mostly skeletal, clothing torn and scattered by scavengers or weather. The skull showed damage I didn't want to examine too closely. Violent death, almost certainly. Scattered around the body were items. A pack, much like mine, torn open and mostly emptied. A canteen. Some kind of weapon I didn't recognize. Papers too degraded to read. Another person who'd tried to survive out here. Another person who'd failed. I stood there looking at the bones for a long time, trying to feel something. Horror, maybe. Fear, compassion. But what I actually felt was a cold, calculating assessment. The canteen was intact. The weapon might be useful if I could figure out how it worked. I took both, adding them to my pack, and kept walking. That night, I understood I was changing. The person who'd left the vault 5 days ago would have been horrified by casually looting a corpse. Would have felt something about the anonymous death, the violence, the waste. This person, the one I was becoming, felt primarily relief that the body had been old enough that I didn't have to smell decay. Marcus had tried to warn me. The weight changes you. Constant survival pressure strips away the parts that don't contribute to continued existence. Empathy was expensive. Sentiment was luxury. What remained was the calculating core that assessed every situation for danger and resource value. I'd been outside less than a week, and I was already not the person I'd been. The 6th day I ran out of food. Not completely, I had 1 more meal's worth of preserved rations. But the math was clear. I was nowhere near the settlement, assuming it existed, and I was even heading the right direction. Even if I maintained current pace, which was slowing as exhaustion accumulated, I was looking at another 3 or 4 days minimum. I could ration the last meal into smaller portions. Could make it stretch maybe 2 days if I was willing to operate on minimal calories. After that, hunting, maybe. Scavenging. Hoping I found something edible before I got too weak to keep moving. The irony wasn't lost on me. In the vault, I dreamed of freedom from control, from limitation, from the suffocating sameness of regulated existence. Out here, I'd discovered that regulations had made life possible. Without them, I wasn't free, I was just unsupported. That night, I made shelter in what had been some kind of office building. Multiple floors still partially standing. Enough structural integrity that I could get several levels off the ground. Height meant safety from ground-level threats, or so I hoped. I found a room with an intact door I could secure, cleared the debris, and settled in for what I knew would be another sleepless night. My body was exhausted, but my mind wouldn't stop, wouldn't release the vigilance that had become automatic. I thought about the vault, about the bed I'd slept in for 19 years, with its clean sheets and climate control and absolute safety. About meals that appeared on schedule, nutritionally balanced and sufficient. About water that flowed from taps without thought, clean and unlimited. About parents who'd begged me to stay. I'd called them trapped. Called myself trapped. But maybe the real trap was the certainty that anywhere else would be better. The inability to recognize sufficiency as its own kind of gift. The radio beacon was still in my pack. I could activate it again, send another signal that I was alive. Or I could acknowledge reality that being alive at day 6 wasn't triumph, just extended prologue to inevitable failure. I left it dormant. If I died out here, at least they wouldn't know exactly when. Small mercy. The 7th day I found the settlement, or what remained of it. Walls still stood rough barriers made from scavenged materials and pre-war debris. Structures inside the walls, some intact, some collapsed. But no people, no movement, no smoke from fires or sound of activity. I approached carefully, every sense alert for threats. The silence was wrong. Even an abandoned place should have ambient sound wind through structures, animals moving through, something. This silence felt deliberate, held. The entrance gate was open, just open. Not torn down or breached, but standing wide like someone had left and forgotten to close it. Inside, the evidence of violence was everywhere. Bullet holes in walls, burn marks from fires, dark stains on ground that could have been anything but probably weren't. But no bodies. Either they'd been cleared, or scavengers had been thorough. I moved through the settlement in a daze, my pack feeling heavier with each step. This had been my goal. The place Marcus had described, where people survived together, where community existed outside the vault, the destination that had justified every hardship of the journey. Gone, destroyed, empty. In what had been the central building, I found supplies. Not much. The raiders or whoever had hit the place had been thorough, but some things remained. Preserved food in containers too damaged to be worth carrying. Medical supplies scattered on the floor. A water filtration system, broken but potentially repairable. I gathered what I could carry, moving with mechanical efficiency. The disappointment was too large to process, so I didn't. Just focused on immediate utility. I had resources now. That was something. That night I stayed in the settlement, in one of the more intact buildings. Used the door and barricades to create security, lit a small fire in a contained space, and ate the first hot meal I'd had since leaving the vault. The warmth should have been comfort. Instead it felt like mockery. All this way for ashes and ruins, and the confirmation that Marcus's settlement had lasted exactly as long as he'd said until it didn't. I tried to think about next steps, about where to go from here. About whether to keep moving or stay and try to make this place work alone, about whether survival by yourself even counted as survival. But thinking required energy I didn't have. Instead, I sat staring at the fire until it burned down to coals, then embers, then darkness. The 8th day I didn't leave the settlement, told myself I was resting, recovering, assessing options. Really, I was just stuck. The weight Marcus had warned about had finally exceeded my capacity to move under it. I spent the day sorting through the settlement's remains, looking for anything useful. Found more supplies than I'd expected. People fleeing violence didn't pack efficiently, and raiders only took what had obvious immediate value. Preserved food, medical supplies, tools, clothing, even some ammunition for weapons I'd found. Also found evidence of lives. Personal effects too worthless to loot but heavy with meaning. A child's toy, broken, A photograph of people smiling, pre-war quality but post-war subjects, letters that had never been sent. The small fragments people collected when they tried to make shelter into home. I put them all in a pile and burned them. Not out of malice or disrespect, but because having them visible was unbearable. Someone else's failed attempt at survival didn't need to haunt me. That night, I activated the radio beacon, sent the signal that I was alive at day 8, then sat holding the device, wondering what would happen if I just kept pressing it. If I sent an emergency signal, triggered the protocols that said I needed rescue, would they come? Could they even come? Or was the separation permanent in both directions? I didn't press it, but I thought about it. That was its own kind of failure. The 9th day, I finally admitted what I'd known since finding the settlement. I couldn't survive alone. Not wouldn't, couldn't. The skills required for solo wasteland survival were beyond what I possessed. I could maybe stay in the settlement, use it as a base, scavenge in increasing radius until the local area was exhausted. But that was just slow death, isolation gradually eroding the last fragments of humanity until I became something else entirely. Or I could move. Try to find another settlement, another group, another context where human cooperation was still possible. Risk the journey, the exposure, the chance that everywhere else had met the same fate as this place. Neither option felt like survival. Both felt like extended methods of dying. I spent the day preparing to leave. Sorted my supplies, took the best of what the settlement offered, packed with more experience than I'd had 8 days ago. The pack was heavier but better organized. I had weapons now, had better tools, had learned hard lessons about rationing and water sourcing and shelter assessment. Had learned, mostly, that I wasn't equipped for this. Preparation and equipment couldn't compensate for fundamental unsuitability. The 10th day I left the settlement heading southwest. Not based on Marcus's map that had proven useless, but on something I'd found in the settlement ruins. A different map, hand-drawn, showing locations of other known groups. It was months old, maybe years, but it was something. The nearest marked location was 2 weeks away at optimistic travel pace. 2 weeks through terrain I didn't know, with supplies that would last maybe 10 days if I was careful. I walked because the alternative was staying, and staying was just waiting to die. The landscape had stopped feeling novel. It was just terrain now, obstacle between current location and theoretical destination. The ruins were just ruins. The sky was just the thing overhead. Even the radiation had become background condition, the dosimeter's clicks just ambient sound. I'd wanted this. Wanted to experience the world without walls. Wanted to test myself against something real and uncontrolled. Wanted freedom from the vault's limitations. What I'd found was that limitation and freedom weren't opposites. The vault limited physical space but enabled psychological space. Out here, physical space was infinite, and psychological space was contracting daily under the pressure of survival necessity. I'd traded one cage for another, just taken longer to recognize the bars. The days blurred, walking, scavenging, sleeping poorly, moving again. My body was adapting, feet hardening, muscles learning the rhythm of irregular terrain, lungs adjusting to unfiltered air. But adaptation wasn't triumph. It was just the process of damage becoming normal. I found water sources, found shelter, found enough scavenged food to keep moving. Each small success felt hollow because it only enabled more of the same. More walking, more sleeping in ruins, more waking to grey sky and making decisions with incomplete information. I saw more bodies. Not many, but enough to establish pattern. The wasteland was littered with failed survival attempts, people who'd tried to make it work and discovered they couldn't. I stopped examining them closely after the 3rd, stopped feeling anything when I found them. They were just landmarks, warnings, confirmation. Twice I saw other travelers in the distance. Both times I hid until they passed. Not because they seemed threatening necessarily, but because I'd learned that unknown variables were dangerous variables. Better to avoid than engage. The isolation was corrosive in ways I hadn't anticipated. Humans weren't meant for this much solitude, this much internal conversation without external reference. My thoughts were becoming strange, looping, returning to the same questions without resolution. Why had I left? What had I expected to find? What had I actually wanted? I told myself it was about freedom, about experiencing life beyond walls. But maybe it was simpler and worse than that. Maybe I'd just been unable to accept sufficiency, unable to recognize that controlled and safe wasn't the same as empty and wrong. The vault had been enough. I'd chosen to make it insufficient. On day 17, I found other people, not travelers in the distance, an actual group camped in a settlement that was clearly established, clearly functional. Walls, structures, smoke from cooking fires, the sound of voices and activity. I watched from concealment for hours, trying to assess, trying to decide if approaching was survival or suicide. They looked organized, looked like they had systems, structures, division of labor, looked like what the vault had been, but exposed, vulnerable, held together by cooperation rather than walls. Finally, I approached openly, hands visible and empty, making myself obviously non-threatening. Got about 30 yards before someone called out, not hostile but firm. That's close enough. State your business. I stated my business. Traveling alone, looking for community, had supplies to trade, skills to contribute, no attachments or complications. The woman who'd called out armed, alert, clearly security considered me for a long moment. Then, wait there. I waited. Tried not to look threatening while also trying not to look weak. The balance was delicate. Eventually someone else came out. Older, with the kind of weathered face that spoke to decades of wasteland living. Authority figure, clearly. Leader or close to it. You came from the east, he said. Statement, not question. Yes. Alone. Yes. Vault dweller. Another statement. Apparently it was obvious in ways I couldn't see. Was, I said. He studied me with eyes that had seen enough to make assessment automatic. We can offer temporary shelter. 3 days. You work, you eat. After that we decide if you stay or move on. Clear? Clear. That was how I learned that survival wasn't about escaping limitation. It was about finding the right limitations, the ones that enabled rather than imprisoned. The settlement wasn't the vault, wasn't safe or controlled or certain. People still got sick, still died, still made bad choices and suffered consequences. But they did it together, which made the weight distributable rather than crushing. I worked those 3 days, helped with water hauling and wall maintenance and the 1,000 small tasks that kept a settlement functioning. Learned names, heard stories, started understanding the social dynamics that made cooperation possible. On the 3rd day, the leader, his name was Thomas, called me aside. You can stay if you want, he said. We need people willing to work, need fresh perspectives. You seem competent enough, and you're clearly motivated. Thank you, I said. But understand something. He met my eyes directly. You left the vault looking for freedom, thinking walls were the problem. What you need to understand is that we've got walls too, just different ones. Rules about resources, about conflict resolution, about who makes decisions and when. You want complete independence, total freedom from limitation. You need to keep walking. That's not what we offer. What do you offer? Company, structure, the ability to survive without carrying the entire weight alone. He gestured at the settlement around us. It's not perfect. Nothing out here is perfect. But it's something. I thought about the vault, about my parents who'd understood what I couldn't, that the walls weren't prison, they were framework. About the community I'd abandoned because I couldn't accept that controlled didn't mean empty. I'd like to stay, I said. Thomas nodded. Then welcome. You'll have a place to sleep, work to do, and expectations to meet, same as everyone. That was 6 months ago. I'm still here, still working, still learning, still adapting to a version of survival I hadn't imagined when I walked out of the vault. It's not what I dreamed about when I touched that door at 11 years old. It's not freedom in the abstract, perfect sense I'd been chasing, but it's life. Complicated and difficult and requiring constant negotiation between individual want and collective need, but life nonetheless. I think about the vault sometimes, about whether I'd make the same choice knowing what I know now. The honest answer is, I don't know. The person who made that choice doesn't exist anymore, been worn away by the wasteland and rebuilt into something different. I activated the radio beacon once more, about a month after joining the settlement, sent the signal that I was alive, that I'd found something like stability, hoped it reached them, hoped they understood it meant gratitude as much as confirmation. I was wrong about a lot of things, wrong about what freedom meant, wrong about what survival required, wrong about the vault being the problem when really the problem was me, my inability to recognize sufficiency until I'd experienced insufficiency. But I was right about one thing. Staying would have killed me. Maybe not physically, maybe not quickly, but the slow erosion of living in a place I couldn't accept would have hollowed me out eventually. The wasteland almost killed me instead. Would have, probably, if I hadn't found this settlement, these people, this particular version of structure that I can accept. I don't know if that counts as success. I don't know if survival is the same as living, or if finding a community is the same as finding home. I don't know if the cost was worth it, or if my parents would think what I've gained justifies what I gave up. What I know is I'm here. Still breathing, still moving, still changing, still carrying weight, but distributed now among people who understand it. The vault was sufficient. The wasteland is not. This settlement is something between imperfect shelter in an indifferent world, held together by people who've chosen the same calculated compromise between independence and survival. It's not what I dreamed of when I put my hand against that door. But it's what I've got, and that's enough.